math is a place where it was very straightforward for a very long time. It was, you got a lesson in class, you did 20 practice problems, you were tested on it at the end of the week, right? And we saw that same cycle, but what we did not see was necessarily the conceptual understanding kind of coming all the way through. And so when we talk about quote unquote new math, really what it's doing is it's challenging students to make meaning of that math.
Math can be a challenging subject for many students, often leading to feelings of frustration and self-doubt. But what if there were ways to make math more accessible and even enjoyable? How can we build math confidence in students who struggle with traditional teaching methods? Katie Tabari and Lindsay Kapek, founders of Prep Set Go, join us to explore innovative approaches to math education for neurodivergent minds. From understanding the variation of learning needs in students to implementing low-floor, high-ceiling tasks, we'll uncover strategies that can transform the math experience for all students. That's straight ahead on episode 238. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Our kids headed back to school this week, which is always a mixed bag of emotions. Our oldest is a junior this year, which makes me realize that it will be the 12th year, not counting preschool, that I've been on the parent end of advocating for neurodivergent students. I know there are so many passionate educators out there who are working to make a difference. And that's why we're hosting our second annual Creating Neurodiversity Affirming Schools event. This live event will be held on Zoom and will include a panel of experts sharing their thoughts and answering your questions about how to best support neurodivergent learners in the classroom. The event is free, and we would love for you to join us, or at least register so you can get access to the recording after. You can go to neurodiversity.university to register, or click the link in the show notes. Okay, Katie Tabari and Lindsay Kapek are with me next.
On a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
If I'm working with somebody, they like neurodiversity, right? They've come for that reason. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, it's people who are finding utility in that new label. But what I tell people is that labels, including diagnoses, especially mental health diagnoses, right? These are disorders, not diseases. They're collections of symptoms that we have found it useful to group together. And it is useful, and it's valid, and it's real. And they're still constructs. We made them up because they're useful, and they're arbitrarily applied. Two different diagnosticians will give two different responses about what a person is or is not.
That's episode 130. Find it in your favorite podcast app.
So today I am here with two guests.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Kapek.
I'm Katie Tabari.
Lindsay and Katie are educators who work to create opportunities for neurodivergent students so they can excel in math. So thank you both so much for being here today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start off and talk a little about the experience that a lot of neurodivergent students have in school related to math. And of course, this isn't all neurodivergent kids, because there are tons of neurodivergent kids who are excellent mathematicians. However, there are others who, like me, learn at a really young age that they are bad at math. So for me personally, it was because I struggled with processing speed and working memory. So I wasn't super fast related to fluency in math. And as math progressed, I had a hard time remembering the steps for various algorithms. So I would love to hear from you about what some of the barriers are that neurodivergent students face related to building math skills.
You know, I think they face a lot, to be honest with you. I think so often the way that math was once taught a long time ago, especially like when I was in school, is very set up for a student who can go in, memorize their multiplication facts, apply those, and all of a sudden put something on a piece of paper that maybe they do or don't understand, but they can follow the rules really well. And for a lot of neurodivergent students, that's a really challenging thing to be asking of them, right? We're asking them to memorize something that maybe they do or don't understand. We're asking them to therefore then put something on paper and follow a lot of steps at times. And so I think there's a lot of barriers to entry. That said, I think that's kind of where Katie and I have come in trying to really work with students to get rid of some of those barriers, to help students enjoy math and to really help them gain confidence in the area of mathematics.
Yeah, I think one issue, especially when it comes to math, is we often have fallen into the habit of assuming more of a fixed mindset. Either I'm good at something or I'm bad at something. I think this can be particularly true for neurodivergent learners and those learners with ADHD, especially when educators don't understand what might be going on for those learners. And I think often when we don't understand something, we start to make assumptions. And I think those assumptions can be felt by our students so that they might just feel like I'm a behavior problem, right? Or I just can't focus, or I'm not good at math. These kinds of subliminal messaging that can often come through when educators don't fully understand what may be going on for a student in their processing and just their modes of thinking.
I agree. I think there's so many complicating factors. And of course, on the flip side, there are some of those traits for neurodivergent learners that can really help them in the math classroom. So what are some of those traits that you really notice that actually stand out and can be used as an asset, could be leveraged to help them find that success?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of neurodivergent students are super good problem solvers, especially when it comes to thinking outside of the box, right? Oftentimes we have like a little box that a lot of our students might fit in, and some of our neurodivergent students are willing to go outside of that box and in fact are really comfortable outside of that box, coming up with ways to potentially solve problems that are unique and different and maybe even more efficient in terms of getting toward the answer. I think that they're also okay with chaos in a classroom. And I think that sometimes that also can really be beneficial for their learning, in that they are really able to kind of sit with however the classroom is working and be able to use that as a strength. Now, that doesn't go for all neurodivergent students, because we also know that some don't like chaos at all. And that said, those students also bring a quiet presence to the classroom that can also help and support. I also think that the fact that a lot of our neurodivergent students can multitask and can kind of do two different things at once and can maybe listen to a student here, but also kind of have their own processing going on, can support them in the math classroom.
Yeah, I think anytime we can bring all student voices to the table, we benefit as teachers, and our students also benefit, and it enriches the discussions and the tasks. And oftentimes it's our neurodivergent learners that bring some really unique and interesting perspectives to the table that allow us to see things through a different lens, which is so powerful in mathematics. And I think it's something that was often sort of not part of the equation in the past. But I think now, as we've learned more about math and different math systems and different ways of approaching things, we've understood that there is not just one way, and there is not just one way that is most efficient, because that definition shifts and changes for different learners, different thinkers, different cultures, and we understand that so much more now. So being able to bring those unique perspectives to the table and hear from all of our students, most particularly those who may be neurodivergent, I think just really enriches the learning for everyone.
I'm also reminded, when you're talking about those different methods for math, one of the critiques that I often hear is about this quote unquote new math. And, we talk about Common Core and all these things, and these conversations have been going on forever. So my first year teaching, which was over 20 years ago, my school district was pretty progressive. We had one of these newer math systems that kind of did some of the spiraling, and they weren't exactly always expected to master the skill before we moved on, because we would come back to it. I know that for people who are adults, who are parents, and again, 20 years ago, most of us weren't ever exposed to that type of learning. So it's very confusing for us when our kids come home. Hopefully some of those children who were at the forefront of that are now becoming the parents, so they have a better understanding of it. But can you just give a little bit of an explanation about why that is so important?
Well, I think that we know that students think in different ways, and to be able to look at a different way to solve a problem, or to look at 3 or 4 different ways to solve a problem, can be so beneficial for a student, because there might be one that really works for them. I spent plenty of time in a middle school classroom, actually. And so I know a lot of the new math kind of rolled out, or as they called it, new math, rolled out in elementary school classrooms and kind of fickles up to middle school. But when we kind of talked about it in middle school, it was like, this is just different ways to approach a problem. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to master all 5 ways to solve a problem. But the real reason why is we're trying to expose students, right? And we're trying to look at how can we look at solving a problem in 5 different ways and what way works for you? And maybe one of those 5 ways works, but also maybe there's a different way that works for you. One of the things Katie and I really like to go back to is how can we bring it back to the concrete? How can we really bring it back to something that helps students to be able to understand what they're working with, whether that be hands-on, whether that be drawing a picture, whether that be, whatever that might look like for them, but making meaning out of the math that they're doing. I think the thing that's hard is that as education changes, as math education especially changes, people are uncomfortable at times with that beginning change. And math is a place where I think it was very straightforward for a very long time. It was you got a lesson in class, you did 20 practice problems, you were tested on it at the end of the week, right? And we saw that same cycle, but what we did not see was necessarily the conceptual understanding kind of coming all the way through. And so when we talk about quote unquote new math, really what it's doing is it's challenging students to make meaning of that math so that they can take what they're learning and apply it into a different context, maybe down the road, or apply it to a problem that they don't know how to solve and go, oh, but I do know how to do this and I do know how to do this. So I can put those pieces together and therefore I can learn more.
Mm-hmm. I think a critical piece of that in terms of the families who may be supporting our learners is making sure that we're communicating this new math, explaining kind of the genesis of it, the rationale behind it, helping people to understand. Because I think, again, when people don't understand, they see something that looks different and it's foreign to them. And then parents and caregivers can often feel isolated from the learning process because they can't support the student at home in the way that aligns with what the student may be seeing in the classroom, right? So then I think a lot of parents are often in the position where a student is saying like, this isn't how my teacher's telling me to do this. And the parent just wants to teach the algorithm to the kid. And it gets kind of messy. In my personal experience, I think the best way to address that is through communication, taking advantage of those math nights at school when parents and caregivers come into the school and actually educating parents and families on some of these new math practices. And I think once people experience it, particularly the hands-on aspects of it that Lindsay was referring to, everybody just starts to get excited and engaged. And I think a lot of us from those older generations like myself suddenly start feeling a little bit frustrated that it wasn't taught that way when I was younger, because I kind of have come to realize actually how scary it is that I knew all these algorithms, but most of the time I really had no idea what was happening functionally or conceptually behind it. So I think the more we have those conversations and we can educate the community about these new methods of teaching, it sort of upends the kind of mysteriousness to it. And by its nature, it brings everybody along with it. And people actually tend to get really excited about it.
Yeah. We've talked occasionally, but honestly not enough on this podcast about dyscalculia. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about just basically what is dyscalculia and how might it show up in the classroom or intersect with other types of neurodivergence?
Lindsay, you may have some experience with it at the middle school level. I feel like it's something that, at least in my experience, has been diagnosed a little later. That my focus has been more K through 5 elementary. But yeah. Lindsay, have you come across?
So it is a learning disorder that often disrupts a person's ability to understand numbers and math-related concepts. And so really, truthfully, what we're kind of looking at is a student who has a difficulty maybe recognizing numbers. They might be struggling actually in the beginning of learning how to count and being able to kind of keep track of numbers in their head. They're losing track when they count. They need to use visual aids like their fingers often to help them kind of stay on track. Those are going to be kind of the earlier signs. I think in the middle school, we often see it where they start to kind of mix up what they're doing, right? So they're getting operations mixed up often, or they're switching their numbers around. That's kind of how I've kind of come in contact with it. And I don't think it's well understood. And to your point, I mean, Emily, I taught math in the classroom for 15 years, and I will say it would be on learning plans, but it was never something that was really talked about. And I think it is an undiscussed learning disorder often. And I don't necessarily honestly know why.
Yeah.
It's one of those, I think we focus on dyslexia a lot because it really impacts the student's ability to read. And we focus on all these other aspects and areas. And I think it is an area that really affects a student's ability to understand math. And yet I think it's become okay in our society at times that, oh, they're just not great at math.
Yeah.
And we've kind of said, well, oh, that's fine. They're just not good at math. And they'll be fine as they move over. They can have a calculator as they go on. And yes, those are all great supports for students. And also, I do think it's an area that probably needs to be understood better by teachers and families.
Yeah.
And I think there's a broader issue that I've been thinking a lot about lately, is particularly with the work that Lindsay and I are trying to do and the work that you're doing, Emily, which is that traditionally, I think a lot of our professional development efforts have really kind of centered around understanding or knowing the content of what you might be teaching or a new curriculum that may have just come out. And the more that we learn about neurodivergent learners and different ways that our students may be learning things, we're understanding more and more, I think, in this day and age, how significant and important it is for us to understand our learners. And I just don't think there's been a heavy emphasis, or at least enough of a heavy emphasis, on that piece when it comes to professional development for teachers. I think we're seeing it more and more now. I think the first kind of wave, in my experience, was a lot of trauma-informed trainings, which has been fabulous. And I think it's helped move us along in education. But I haven't seen enough professional development around things like dyscalculia or ADHD or other neurodivergent topics that I think educators can really benefit from, because I can teach a lesson beautifully, deliver the content beautifully, but if I don't understand my students, if I don't have a relationship with them, if I don't understand how they process and connect, it's going to blow over many of my students' heads. The more I can understand who my students are and how they process, the more I can tailor my instruction to meet them where they are, which benefits me because my teaching becomes more effective. It benefits my learners because they're able to grow. They feel seen. They feel understood. They feel confident that they're getting the support that they need to succeed. And I wish that we had more opportunities. So it makes me very excited when I see things like education and professional development efforts in the realm of neurodiversity, because there just hasn't been enough of that in the past.
When we talk about instructional practices for supporting neurodivergent students, whatever that type of neurodivergence may be, the feedback that often comes across that it's going to just be too hard to implement these strategies for just a few students. But what we're really discussing is universal design and finding ways that are good for all students and not just neurodivergent students. So I want to talk about what those environments might look like and how they can help. So what are some of the easy things that teachers can implement and get a really high response from the students on it?
I think number one, when I really think about classroom, is a connection with the students. And I think if we can pull ourselves back to what is our connection with each and every student in a classroom, I think that's where a lot of change is going to begin in and of itself. I think we can look at all these different strategies, and yes, we will talk about a lot of them, but I think none of those strategies are going to work if there's not a connection with the students. So I think number one to me is teachers finding the time to make that connection, especially in the beginning of the school year, so that that student comes into the classroom and feels welcomed and warmed and like they're understood by their teacher. Now, some strategies that work, I think, particularly well in the math classroom, starting off the lesson with something that's engaging. I think a way to hook your students into the learning, whether that be a little video, whether that be a funny question, whether that be, a silly joke, whatever that might be. I think something that gathers their attention, I think especially for our learners with ADHD, of which I am myself, I think is really helpful to get them excited about what we're learning. And they'll go, oh, I kind of want to learn more. And so maybe I don't love math, but wait a second, I want to know the answer to the problem, or I want to know more of what she's talking about. I also think giving students manageable tasks, and I think breaking things down in a way that is manageable, that doesn't feel overwhelming. I think as teachers, there's so much that we want to teach in a lesson, and there's so much we want to teach during the school year, and we have pressure from the district, and we have pressure from all sorts of different places in terms of trying to get through content. And sometimes I think we inadvertently give our students assignments or things that are a little bit too complex at the moment for them. And so if we can break tasks down into smaller, more manageable pieces. Yes, the output is still the same, but they're getting that support along the way and they're learning how to manage without feeling that external pressure or stress. So to me, those are two of the really big ones, I think.
I would just add to that from a more general perspective, I just think it's really interesting, that feeling, and I felt it too as a teacher, when it just felt like something was going to be too hard, right? To incorporate a new approach or strategy to meet my students wherever they might be. But oftentimes it's actually just really, it can be very little easy steps that we can take in our classroom that can effectuate a really big change. And that's a great spot to be in, right? Not a lot of effort for a big reward. And I think some of those things can include just something as simple as really creating an atmosphere filled with growth mindset, language, and support, where we're letting our learners know that this is a safe community, a safe space for us to explore and learn together, that there is not just one right way, and that nobody is either good or bad at something, that everybody has the opportunity to grow, and that everybody is really working to better themselves, and less of an emphasis on competing with your classmates or your peers, that we are each on our own learning trajectory, and that we are empowered to help ourselves move along that trajectory wherever we might be. And that the markers of success is more about how we can move ourselves along that trajectory, not where we might be relative to other learners in the classroom. And that can just come down to things like the language that we use in our classrooms, the environment that we create in our classrooms, having more opportunities for collaboration, more opportunities to hear from all students. So that can be as simple as how we set up the desks in our classroom, or how do we open up the floor to discourse in the math classroom so that we can hear from all learners, and just ensuring that we as educators are affirming different approaches, different strategies. A lot of it, I think, comes down to language. Lindsay and I had a really fun experience when we presented at NCTM in Seattle earlier this year, where we worked with teachers to shift our lens and shift our language away from a deficit-based perspective towards more of a strength-based perspective. And we had a simple exercise that we all engaged in, where we essentially just took a negative term and basically flipped it on itself to flip that into a strength. There was one about not being able to focus. And I remember somebody said, and Lindsay, you can help me here, but somebody said that a participant who has ADHD said that they're all noticing. So it might seem like I'm not focused, but in fact, I'm actually taking everything in. Mm-hmm. So how can we flip, our language so that something that might be perceived as a deficit can be perceived as a strength? And that was a really fun activity and very, very powerful. But I think, things like language, and then offering lots of hands-on opportunities, I think, to explore with math is another kind of pretty easy shift that we can make in our classroom. A lot of teachers are already using manipulatives, but the more we can sort of bring that forth and carry that through the grade levels. Manipulatives are not just for kindergarten through second grade. There's absolutely no reason why we should be putting those manipulatives away when we're getting into middle school and high school and beyond. I know for myself, I never did well at math until calculus, which is insane, but it's because my calculus teacher brought in manipulatives and made everything visual. And suddenly I could understand and see where these formulas were coming from and what they meant. And once I understood that, I felt like I had a point of entry. And I think that's another key, is just making sure that all students have a point of entry. So another really basic way we can do that is by incorporating lots of low floor, high ceiling tasks in the classroom so that all students can participate, but there's also no limit to how far we can go with the learning and the rich discussions that we can have around it. But making sure that there's an entry point for everyone can be one of those small shifts that we can make to really make our classrooms more inclusive.
Yeah. Can you give me an example of one of those low floor, high ceiling tasks?
Yeah. One of our favorites is what's called a 3-act task. There are others out there that I absolutely love: counting collections, choral counts, quick images. These are all opportunities for rich math discourse and opportunities for number talks where we can affirm different approaches, different strategies. But 3-act tasks is one of our favorites. I think one of the reasons that we love it so much is that it can really extend across multiple grade levels in a really kind of smooth, elegant way. So a 3-act task is essentially a task that begins with a hook that's usually visual. It can be an image or it can be a short little video that has the potential for a math inquiry. So oftentimes it might be something like, one of our favorites is using pom-poms. We love pom-poms in mathematics, using pom-poms to support place value, all sorts of different things. But with the 3-act task, we have a little short video where we fill a bowl with these colored pom-poms and we put a lid on it. And it's a really short kind of TikTok style video. So students are immediately engaged and curious. And so what happens with the 3-act task is once you show that visual, you then pose a question to the class about that visual. And that question can change over time. You can use the same visual time and again and pose different questions. But in that scenario, a simple inquiry might be, how many pom-poms are in the bowl? And Act 1 allows students to essentially notice and wonder what is going on in the video, what's going on in the image, and have discussions around what they're seeing and start to begin to make estimates about what their answers might be to that point of inquiry, and start to kind of get a range of what might be too high, what might be too low. Act 2 then allows students the opportunity to work together, oftentimes in small groups, to go ahead and strategize about how they can come up with a more specific answer, how they can essentially solve that question. And that affords a lot of opportunities for collaboration, all voices to be heard, students working together. And then in Act 3, you have what's called the big reveal, where you give them, the final answer and show them how many pom-poms in this example were in fact in the bowl. But that really gives students an opportunity to play with strategizing, working together, coming up with different approaches. The more creative you can be with your approaches, the more I think students shine. There oftentimes can be an add-on of a 4th act that essentially allows students to come up with their own inquiries about the image or video, which is incredibly empowering for students. And then, what can be fun is to sort of in the next week, you choose one of the inquiries that the students came up with, and that can be, the sort of add-on and so on and so forth, so that we can actually explore the student-led inquiries together as a class.
And I think the 3-act task, and one of the reasons why I love them is they're an awesome introduction also to like new content. So like in middle school, for example, they're a brilliant way to start something new because every student can come at it and can have an insertion point in terms of understanding the math that's kind of starting to go on. And now all of a sudden they're kind of interested in what's going to be coming next. And so it just allows students who maybe don't want to participate often or often struggle to find a way to participate in math class in particular. It gives them an option and an opportunity to do so.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's really lovely about 3-act tasks or low floor, high ceiling tasks in general is it really takes the emphasis away from the answer and places the emphasis far more on the process, which I think is something that can lend itself to our students feeling more confident. It kind of gets us away from being so hooked on whether I'm right or wrong. Again, that's kind of living in that fixed mindset world, right? Right or wrong, good or bad. And it really kind of puts us in the mindset of process and how we can figure something out, and persisting and grit. All these things that we know are such markers for success for students, far more so than right or wrong.
I love that. And I think it really goes into everything that we're talking about how important having a sense of competence and confidence goes so far with math. I mean, I always look back, I know, on my own experience, as an ADHDer who, again, learned in 3rd grade that I was bad at math. And that was just that fixed mindset totally. I mean, that was part of how I chose what career to go into. And I look back and I'm like, I could have done this. I could have figured this out. Like, I just didn't have any confidence to even try. And I think that's what we really want to instill with kids.
And math is the subject area with the most fixed ability messaging, more so than in reading or writing or any other subject area. It's math is really where we fall most victim to that way of thinking. I'm either good or bad at something. And the reality is there's no reason why, that should be a more fixed ability area than anything else. It's because we perceive it as kind of right or wrong. We haven't understood, I think, fully that math is actually so much more about systems, structures, organization, process. It's not so much about right or wrong. Of course, we want to get the right answer. I don't want to take away from that, but far more powerful than that is the process.
And I would add to that, I currently work with a bunch of middle school and high school students in terms of math tutoring as well as executive function coaching. And one of the biggest things that I notice is as soon as we can get their confidence up, the better that they all of a sudden are doing in their math class. And it's one of those of, it doesn't take a lot. It's just explaining a concept in a different way, having them explain it back. Sometimes it's just them talking through what they think we should do and affirming those steps along the way. Sometimes it's just listening to them vent, saying this is really hard and saying, yeah, you're right. How can we help you so that you have a better in on it? Because as soon as their confidence goes up, they're willing to try that next topic and then that next topic. And as things start to build on math, right, they all of a sudden have a newfound understanding of what they're able to do. And know that, hey, if I put a little bit of work in, I think that I'm going to be able to understand this. And those pieces start to click.
And the more we understand what their struggles are and how we can help them, the more we can, do things like break problems apart or procedures apart into small bite-sized chunks that fit where our students may be to help them feel comfortable and supported along the way and provide those graphic organizers and those things that can really help them map out the procedure instead of having to carry the mental weight of it, but being able to kind of break it apart on paper. Lindsay and I are big on providing those kinds of resources to students, as well as, I love, Lindsay, what you were saying about the collaborative approach between teachers and students. And I think that's another big shift in education that makes me really happy, especially for neurodivergent learners. But frankly speaking, all of these strategies benefit all of our learners. But I think teachers and students working together to have those conversations. How can I support you? How do you learn best? And mapping that out together. We have a fun planner that we love to use. Teachers can use for essentially having those conversations and mapping it out. Not unlike, the same kind of thing you might do for an IEP or a 504, but making it informal and something that you do with your students in your classroom at the beginning of the school year. What do you like to use when you're learning? Are you a visual learner? Do you like hands-on? Whatever their go-to strategy might be, discovering that, sitting down with students, going through a form like the one that Lindsay and I have put together where you can basically fill all that out and have students tell you how we can help them and set goals and then be able to check back in on those over the school year to celebrate that growth, which is a huge piece of building student confidence. To be able to kind of take that time and reflect on how they've grown together.
Katie, I think that also goes back into that connection piece, right? That we talk about, that the more we can connect and understand our students, they can feel heard. Therefore, they're willing to work harder maybe for that teacher, or they might be willing to try a little bit harder to do something that's uncomfortable or not be afraid to make a mistake because they know they're not going to be judged by it. They know nobody's going to laugh at them, for example, in the class, right? So setting those things up really can set our whole class up for success. And I think Katie's right. These strategies go across the board. I actually presented to a group of teachers on Wednesday, and one of the teachers wrote in a question afterwards, and she said, I have a question. And she's like, and that is, why are we looking at this from what strategies can we implement into our classrooms, but why not are we looking at it? How can we change our classrooms as a whole to make all learners feel welcome? And I think that really taps into maybe, in an ideal world, is that where education could be headed?
Well, Katie and Lindsay, I am just really grateful for your time today. As we wrap up, I have one last question for you. If you were talking to a student who was struggling and feeling discouraged in math, what is one thing that you would want to say to them? What's the one thing that you would really want them to hear?
I think for me, it's having been that student and been in that place. The most powerful thing that a teacher said to me was when I arrived, never having been good at math, and I arrived to high school calculus, and I thought, this is going to be the death of me. The first thing that teacher said, Mr. Glaze, I'll never forget him, was, all of you sitting in this classroom here today, many of you probably have it stuck in your brain that you are just not good at math. And I want you to take that thought and throw it out right now. Because in here, we're all learners and we're all going to learn and grow together. And if we do that and we work together and I support you and you commit to, doing the work on your end of things, we'll find success.
I think I would go off of something similar, right? In that, yeah, you're right. This is really hard. And that's okay that that's really hard. And let's work together to find a way so that it's not as hard. Because I know that you can do this. And the goal is that you know that you can do this.
Lindsay Kapek and Katie Tabari, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Emily.
There's one question that a lot of math-hesitant kids ask, which is really hard to answer. Why do they even have to learn this stuff? They have calculators and AI, and they don't even want a career that has to do with math anyway. My answer to this has evolved over time, and now I do my best to explain it like this. First, building math skills builds critical thinking and problem-solving skills that carry over to other domains. But second, and perhaps most importantly, the foundation of math skills provides a pathway to whatever you may want to do with your future. What a shame it would be if we just chalked up one student's early math struggles as not their strength, and then didn't ask them to take any more classes in that topic. What if that struggle were more related to poor executive functioning skills or other developmental factors that would eventually catch up? What if they found a passion for a career that involved research or technology or engineering? I wish kids would understand how their dislike of math is so rarely actually about disliking math. It's about disliking the frustration of having to learn something that's really hard, or maybe disliking the frequency of homework. Separating those things from the concepts of math can allow our kids to approach these tasks at a pace that works for them and keeps the doors open for whatever future they may choose. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
When someone don't help you through the rain, when feelings don't matter, and everything's nothing but a game. Just know that I'm with you. Just know that I'm with you through it all. And I'm gonna be there whenever you win or if you fall. I know that we will make it through the storm, 'cause you and me been fighters since we were born. It's all over our bodies and hearts. Yeah, you and me been fighters right from the start.
Thanks again to Lindsay Kapek and Katie Tabari. You'll find links to their work, some of the tools they talked about during the chat, and more in the show notes. Don't forget to sign up for our free annual fall event that we've created specifically for educators who are passionate about creating neurodiversity-affirming learning environments for students. The event will be held on Monday, September 23rd, and you can sign up to join Emily and a live panel of experts who will be talking about ways to best support students of all neurotypes. We need you there. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.